Imagine waking up one morning and every fundamental rule you know about how the world works is just gone.
Yeah, I mean, the money in your savings account might be essentially worthless by noon.
Right. The factory you've worked at your entire life technically doesn't belong to anyone anymore.
And that massive, all-powerful government that controlled, every single aspect of your daily existence has simply evaporated into thin air.
It sounds like the setup for some dystopian movie.
It really does.
But for millions of people across Central and Eastern Europe in 1989, that was just a regular Tuesday.
Yep, just reality.
Today, we are cracking open a massive stack of source materials for you. We've got World Bank retrospectives, historical records from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and some incredibly dense political economy papers.
Very dense.
Yeah, we are doing a deep dive into the multifaceted nature of transitional economies, focusing on that incredibly complex, really high-stakes journey from authoritarian governance to market-oriented democracy.
It is a wild ride.
It is. Okay, let's unpack this. Before we get into the on-the-ground chaos of how this actually played out, we need to define our terms.
Good idea.
What exactly is transitioning when a country decides to completely ditch central planning?
Well, it's a foundational question because the immediate assumption most people make is that you're just swapping out an economic engine.
Like trading socialism for capitalism.
Right, exactly. But the source material makes it abundantly clear that it's never just a simple economic swap. A true transition requires a three-dimensional shift, and it's all happening simultaneously.
Okay, and those three dimensions are?
First, you have economic liberalization. This means the state stops dictating the price of a loaf of bread. You free up prices, cut state subsidies to failing factories, open up your borders to international trade.
Right.
Second, you have institutional transformation. You have to build the invisible architecture of a market.
Like what?
Things like property rights, antitrust laws, independent courts, bankruptcy codes, and you have to build them completely from scratch.
From scratch.
Yeah. And then third, you have political restructuring. You're moving from a single-party authoritarian state toward democratization. So free elections and a free press.
So it's not just changing the rules of the game. It's like building a brand new stadium, writing a rule book in a language no one speaks yet, and teaching the players a completely different sport.
All while the game is being broadcast live.
Right.
And that interconnectedness is the absolute most dangerous part. Like, if you free up the economy without creating political accountability, you risk creating a lawless oligarchy.
Makes sense.
But if you open up politics and hold free elections, and then the newly freed economy immediately crashes.
The public is just going to vote to completely reject the new democracy.
Exactly. Which naturally leads us to the reality of how countries actually execute this.
Yeah, if politicians are looking at those three massive systemic shifts, how on earth does societies handle doing them all at once?
Historically, they struggle immensely. What kicked off in 1989 was this unprecedented historical experiment that researchers called the dual transition.
The dual transition.
Right. Never before in human history had nations attempted to build a competitive democratic political system and a capitalist market economy concurrently.
At the exact same time.
Yes. And the standard economic model used to predict what happens to a country when they try this. Well, it's something called the J-curve.
Oh, I've seen this referenced in a few of the papers we read. So you think of the letter J.
Yeah.
The theory predicts that when radical market reforms hit a centrally planned economy, the country's economic output, its employment rates, its overall living standards, they're all going to drop sharply.
Very sharply.
And that downward dip is the bottom of the J.
Right. And it's really important to understand why that drop happens. In a planned economy, supply chains are mandated by government bureaucrats. Factory A sends steel to Factory B because the government said so.
Regardless of the actual cost.
Exactly. So when you remove that central coordinator overnight, those artificial supply chains just snap. The old, incredibly inefficient state industries collapse into bankruptcy before any new, agile private industries have time to grow and take their place.
It honestly sounds like trying to completely gut and remodel your only bathroom while you were still living in the house.
That is a perfect way to put it.
It's just going to be incredibly painful before it gets better. You have to go through the pain of having no plumbing to get to the nice new shower, which is the upward swing of the J.
Exactly. I love that bathroom analogy. And it highlights the core structural danger of the dual transition. Political scientists identify this as the time inconsistency dilemma.
Let me guess. The politicians who initiate the remodel are the ones who get blamed for the house having no working toilet.
You nailed it. Democratic politicians have to inflict this severe, immediate short-term pain on the exact same voters they rely on to get reelected.
That is brutal.
It is. They have to stand at a podium and ask you, the public, to endure skyrocketing inflation and massive unemployment for a future payoff that might be 5 or 10 years away.
And the dilemma is that the voters, who are understandably exhausted by the pain, might simply vote the reformers out.
Right. They elect populist hardliners and reject the transition entirely before the upward swing of the J ever materializes.
So if reformers are looking at that J-curve, and they realize they have to inflict massive pain on their own population just to get to a functional economy, they really only have two ways to survive it politically.
Right.
They either rip the Band-Aid off before the voters can react, or they peel it back so slowly the voters hardly notice.
Yes, the two main strategies.
Let's talk about the Band-Aid approach first.
The famous shock therapy model.
Right.
Yeah.
Adopted by places like Poland, the Czech Republic, and Russia. The sheer scale of what they were dealing with is just staggering.
It's hard to even comprehend.
Yeah, I pulled this statistic from the World Bank data. At the start of their transition in 1990, Poland had roughly 8,400 state-owned enterprises.
Over 8,000.
And the researchers calculated that if Poland tried to sell those off at the careful, deliberate, case-by-case pace that, say, the UK or Mexico used for their privatizations, it would literally take decades.
Decades. And the reformers felt they absolutely did not have decades.
Why not?
Because the rationale for the extreme speed of shock therapy was fundamentally political, not economic. Leaders like Leszek Balcerowicz in Poland believed they were operating in a very brief window. They called it a period of extraordinary politics.
Meaning the euphoria of escaping Soviet domination.
Yes, exactly. That euphoria created a temporary grace period where the public was willing to accept radical, painful changes.
Okay, I see.
The reformers felt they had to act instantly. They had to dismantle the planned economy and privatize assets as fast as possible, primarily to smash the old communist machine so thoroughly that it could never be put back together again.
Okay, so let's contrast that with the slow peel approach, gradualism.
Yeah, right.
The sources point heavily to China and Vietnam with their doi moi policies. In those cases, the state maintained strict authoritarian political control. They didn't even attempt the democratic part of the dual transition.
No, they didn't.
Instead, they implemented this thing called a dual-track pricing system.
This is a brilliant mechanical workaround, honestly. In a dual-track system, the government doesn't just abolish the planned economy overnight.
What do they do instead?
They tell a factory, you still have to produce a strict quota of goods for the state, and we will pay you the old, artificially low, fixed price for it.
So that ensures basic societal stability. The shelves stay stocked.
Exactly. But the twist is what happens after they hit the quota. Anything the factory produces above that state quota, they are suddenly allowed to sell on an open, legalized free market at whatever price people will pay.
Wow.
Yeah, it slowly introduces market incentives and allows a private economy to grow alongside the planned one, eventually outgrowing it entirely.
And by doing that, they completely skipped the terrifying dip in the J-curve.
They did.
But I have to imagine the trade-off is massive institutional friction. Because the state still controls so much wealth and sets the initial quotas, you are practically begging for long-term systemic corruption.
You absolutely are. I mean, they achieved explosive economic growth, but they delayed the deep institutional transformation that ensures fairness and limits state power.
Well, I have to push back on the underlying logic of shock therapy, though, especially when we look at Russia's transition.
Okay, sure.
The texts detail how shock therapy in Russia unleashed hyperinflation that literally wiped out people's entire life savings overnight.
It was devastating.
It led to a nearly 40% drop in their GDP throughout the 1990s. If everyone knew the J-curve was going to cause that much devastation, why did anyone, including those highly educated Western economic advisors who flew into Moscow, think nosediving the economy was a good idea?
Were they just totally naive to the human cost?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, what's fascinating here is that the urgency in Russia wasn't just about preventing a political return of the communists. The Western advisors and Russian reformers were reacting to an immediate, unfolding economic disaster called spontaneous privatization.
Spontaneous privatization. Okay, what does that actually look like on the ground?
Picture a massive, state-owned steel mill in the late 1980s. The central planning system in Moscow is already breaking down. The unaccountable factory manager realizes that the central bureaucrats aren't answering the phones anymore.
No one is watching.
Right, so he just locks the gates, essentially transfers the state's wealth into a newly created private shell company that he owns and starts selling the steel for his own profit.
So the managers were just quietly stealing the country out from under the government.
Exactly. It was a free-for-all. The advocates of shock therapy argued that if the government didn't formalize privatization incredibly rapidly, there would be literally nothing left for the state to privatize.
And managers would take it all.
Right. The entire goal of shock therapy was rapid depoliticization, getting the assets out of the hands of corrupt, entrenched state managers as fast as humanly possible, even if it caused chaos.
Okay, so this fear of insiders stealing everything brings us directly to the biggest plot twist in the entire transition story.
Oh, this is the best part.
Because it turns out the biggest threat to these reforms wasn't who everyone thought it would be. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Going back to the J-curve, the traditional assumption in political science was that the losers of the transition would be the ones to rise up.
By losers, you mean the newly unemployed factory workers, the pensioners whose savings were wiped out.
Yes, the people who lost their social safety nets. Everyone assumed they would riot and vote to stop the reforms.
But the sources introduced this brilliant concept by political scientist Joel Hellman called the partial reform equilibrium.
Yes, Hellman.
He crunched the data and found that the fatal blow to transitioning economies rarely came from the losers. The sabotage actually came from the short-term winners.
This is perhaps the most crucial insight in transition economics. In the chaotic, messy middle phase of transition, when prices were partially freed, but the legal architecture of a market wasn't established yet.
Certain actors made absolute fortunes.
Unbelievable fortunes. We're talking about enterprise insiders, commercial bankers, and outright mafiosi.
Wait, if the rule of law hasn't been fully established yet, are these short-term winners just acting like literal mobsters? Like, are they just stealing assets by physical force, or is there an actual economic loophole they're exploiting to get so rich so fast?
There was a massive systemic loophole.
Arbitrage.
Arbitrage, yes. Because reforms were only partially implemented, the old state economy and the new free market briefly overlapped. These insiders could use their connections to buy subsidized goods like oil or metal from the state at artificially low fixed prices.
Okay.
Then they would immediately turn around and sell those exact same goods on the newly legalized free market or export them abroad at vastly higher world prices.
So they were basically printing their own money with zero risk. Buy oil for $1, sell it for $20, repeat until you're a billionaire.
Precisely. And because they were making such astronomical illicit profits from this gray area, they actively used their new wealth to capture the state.
They bought influence.
Yep. They bribed politicians, bought up media outlets, and they actively worked to freeze the transition halfway.
Because a finished transition ruins the grift.
Exactly. They deliberately blocked the creation of strong, independent courts, antitrust institutions, and transparent property rights. Because a fully functioning, transparent, heavily policed market would kill their arbitrage golden goose.
It's like hiring a crew of contractors to build a bridge across a massive river for your town. But halfway across, the contractors realize they can make an absolute fortune running a private toll ferry over the remaining gap.
Wow. Yeah.
So they actively sabotage the completion of the bridge. They pay off the local politicians to halt construction just to protect their ferry monopoly.
I love that ferry analogy. It perfectly illustrates Hellman's concept. These early winners weaponized the transition against itself. They used the wealth generated by early reforms to ensure the final reforms never happen.
And this sabotage by the short-term winners really exposes a massive, glaring blind spot that the early 1990s reformers had.
They completely underestimated the vital role of the state itself.
Right. The texts talk about how the prevailing economic theory at the time relied heavily on property rights logic.
Right. It assumed that if you just privatize state assets quickly, regardless of how messy it was, the new private owners would naturally lobby the government for good institutions.
The assumption was, if I now own a factory, I naturally want strong property rights, functioning police, and independent courts to protect my factory from being stolen.
But the texts show that instead of building the companies up, these new owners just asset stripped them.
Which makes sense now. I mean, if you acquire a factory, but there are no police or courts to protect your ownership tomorrow, you aren't going to invest in a 10-year modernization plan.
Of course not.
You were going to sell the copper wiring out of the walls today, pocket the cash, and move to London.
Exactly. Without a strong state to enforce the rules of the game, a long-term investment is just a target for theft.
The World Bank retrospective in our source stack is incredibly candid about this failure. They explicitly note that the international community's faith in mass voucher privatization was vastly overemphasized.
Yeah, mass voucher privatization. That was the idea of giving every single citizen a physical voucher, a little piece of paper that represented a tiny share of the nation's wealth.
Right.
The citizens could then use these vouchers to bid on shares in the newly privatizing state companies. It sounded incredibly democratic on paper.
But the sources contrast how this played out mechanically in Russia versus Estonia. In Russia, the state was incredibly weak. The mass privatization was chaotic and corrupt.
Very much so.
It led directly to the rise of the famous Russian oligarchs, especially through a mechanism called the loans for shares scheme.
Oh, yes. The loans for shares scheme is a perfect example of state capture. In the mid-90s, the Russian government under Boris Yeltsin was functionally broke.
And Yeltsin desperately needed cash and media support for his upcoming 1996 re-election campaign, right?
Yes. So the government turned to a small group of wealthy, politically connected bankers. These bankers gave the government loans, and in exchange, the government put up massive, wildly valuable state oil and mining companies as collateral.
And let me guess, the government intentionally defaulted on those loans.
Exactly. They defaulted on purpose, which allowed this tiny group of insiders to keep billions of dollars worth of state assets for absolute pennies.
Unbelievable.
It concentrated the nation's wealth into the hands of a few oligarchs overnight.
Whereas Estonia took a completely different, highly institutional approach. They didn't just throw vouchers into the wind.
No, they didn't.
The sources show that Estonia made a strict rule. Before any company could be privatized, the state had to find a core, legitimate investor, often a reputable foreign company, to take a controlling majority stake in the enterprise first.
Yes, first.
They ensured someone with real capital, technological expertise, and a long-term business plan was actually in charge of the factory. Only then did they allow regular citizens to use their vouchers to buy minority shares.
Meaning the company actually had a steward who cared about its survival, which in turn protected the value of the citizens' shares. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the vital, undeniable lesson drawn from these contrasting outcomes is that institutions matter far more than policies.
Yeah.
You simply cannot have a functioning, fair, free market without a strong, capable, rule-governed state to police it. A weak state doesn't lead to a free market, it leads to a lawless market.
So looking at the critical importance of those institutions, where does that leave these transitional economies today? The research outlines two very divergent paths based entirely on how those foundational institutions were built over the last 30 years.
To understand the present, we really have to acknowledge the psychological starting point of these nations. Decades of Soviet authoritarian rule didn't just destroy economies, it completely destroyed what sociologists call extended trust.
Meaning the ability to trust people outside your immediate family, or to trust public institutions like the courts or the police.
Exactly. Under a totalitarian surveillance state, trusting a stranger or speaking openly could literally get you sent to a gulag.
So trust retreated into very small, tight-knit personal networks.
Yes. But a modern capitalist economy requires you to sign a contract with a total stranger and trust that a judge will enforce it fairly. Rebuilding that generalized societal trust is incredibly difficult.
I can imagine.
But for countries like Poland and the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they had a massive historical advantage: the European Union.
The EU acted as an external anchor.
Yes. If these countries wanted access to the massive wealth of the European common market, they had to meet the rigorous, non-negotiable legal and regulatory requirements of joining the EU.
So the EU essentially acted as a strict auditor.
Exactly. Forcing these countries to rapidly upgrade their courts, increase transparency, and adopt the rule of law. It helped rebuild that extended trust by importing it from the outside.
However, the sources also dedicate significant time to a much darker trend occurring in recent years. We are seeing what political scientists call democratic backsliding.
Yeah.
Particularly in the Visegrad countries, places like Hungary and Poland, and of course the deep entrenched consolidation of authoritarianism in Russia. And I want to make it very clear to you listening right now, we are just neutrally reporting the findings of these political science and economic texts here. We aren't endorsing a political side, just analyzing the mechanics of why voters in these regions began turning away from the Western democratic model.
And that systemic analysis is deeply revealing. The texts explain that in Central Europe, the initial transition model was often an embedded neoliberal approach.
Okay, how did that approach actually function on the ground?
Well, it was a strategy to attract Western capital. These countries offered incredibly low corporate taxes and aggressively suppressed local wages to entice foreign companies, like, say, German automakers, to build factories there.
Right.
They tried to balance this by maintaining some social welfare programs, but over time, the model hollowed out.
The domestic workers felt like second-class citizens in their own economy, building cars for foreign owners while their own wages stagnated.
Exactly. The populations became deeply disillusioned. They felt culturally and economically left behind by the Western-style capitalist democracy model.
So, frustrated with the inequality and this perceived loss of national sovereignty to foreign corporations, voters began eagerly turning toward populist strongmen who promised a radical U-turn.
And this leads to the creation of what the texts describe as the clan state model.
The clan state.
Yeah. Instead of the state being a neutral referee for the market, the newly empowered leaders actively capture the state bureaucracy. They use government contracts, tax audits, and regulatory power not for national development, but to punish their political enemies and reward their loyalists.
So in a clan state, your political loyalty to the ruling party becomes the sole dictator of your economic success.
Yes. Which brings us back to Russia's trajectory. The political economy texts argue that the total lack of institutional trust during Boris Yeltsin's era of chaotic democratization in the 1990s directly paved the way for Vladimir Putin's centralized authoritarian system today.
Because the 90s traumatized the public.
Precisely. Under Yeltsin, democratic norms were constantly undermined by power struggles, massive corruption, and the unchecked power of those oligarchs we mentioned.
Right. It was technically a democracy, but it felt like violent anarchy to the average citizen who couldn't even pay for groceries.
Exactly. So Putin's model offered a direct reversal, reasserting absolute state control over the oligarchs, eliminating political pluralism, and establishing a predictable electoral authoritarian regime.
The public essentially traded the terrifying chaos of a weak democracy for the brutal predictability of centralized control.
Yes, exactly.
So what does this all mean? If we step back and look at the entirety of this deep dive, the most glaring takeaway is that transitioning an economy isn't a math equation you just solve.
No, not at all.
It is a highly fragile, living ecosystem. A functioning democracy and a free market don't just spontaneously generate the moment you remove the dictator. They rely entirely on an invisible, often boring bedrock of societal trust, functional institutions, and a highly capable, constrained state.
It is the unglamorous, tedious work of building impartial courts, training independent auditors, and enforcing property contracts that actually makes human freedom possible.
Which leaves me with a thought that I just haven't been able to shake since we started reading through these materials. Building the deep cultural trust and the complex, impartial institutions required for a fair, free market, well, it takes generations. It is the work of 50 or 60 years.
Yeah.
But democratic political patience, the willingness of an average voter to endure economic hardship, that only lasts for one election cycle.
The time inconsistency dilemma strikes again. The timeline for institutional maturity and the timeline for political survival are fundamentally mismatched.
Exactly. So here's a question for you, the listener, to mull over. If the timeline to build a stable market democracy is 50 years, but the timeline for a politician to keep their job is 4 years, is the perfect transition actually impossible?
That's a huge question.
In fact, might all modern economies, regardless of whether they are post-communist or deeply established Western nations, be in a permanent, never-ending state of transition? Are we all just constantly being forced to rebalance state power, market freedom, and the public's trust before the entire system breaks?
It suggests that democracy and capitalism aren't finish lines you cross and then you're done. They are fragile gardens you have to endlessly weed, defend, and cultivate.
Think back to that imaginary Tuesday morning we talked about at the very start of this deep dive. Waking up to find all the rules of your world completely erased. The millions of people in these transitional economies didn't just have to survive the collapse of their old world, they had to invent a brand new one from scratch while they were living inside it.
It is a monumental, staggering testament to human endurance and adaptability.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep reading, keep wondering, and above all, keep questioning the structures around you.